friend, and today we'll be talking about what is Tailwind and basically everything about Tailwind, right? The story and why, as a developer, as a web developer, you should be using Tailwind, right? That's the objective of today's session. And today we'll be talking about only the theory part of it. Tomorrow we will be covering a practical on how to use Tailwind in one of your projects, right? So to get started, let me talk a bit about myself. Hello to everyone out here. My name is Vasant Srivatsa. I'm a computer geek. I make videos on YouTube and tweet about JavaScript and teach computer science to American students. I have around 8 years of programming experience and 6 years of programming experience in JavaScript alone, right? You can find me at vsnth. That's my name without all the vowels. Vsnth dev on Twitter, GitHub, and LinkedIn. So let's talk about the history of CSS first to get an understanding of what is the problem that Tailwind CSS is trying to solve, right? So this is back in really early days of internet, where we have had browsers like Netscape Navigator and World Wide Web, and really early versions of Internet Explorer, and we had a browser called Mocha, which is a very early version of Firefox. This was all like the pre CSS era, where HTML and the bare bone HTML was the only thing that the internet supported, right? We did not have anything like CSS. um, you know Elements like having an anchor tag, having a link, having a list, or anything having a button, were all basically served by HTML itself, using different HTML tags, where we didn't have to write any CSS, right? This was like how websites looked during the pre CSS era, where there was no CSS at all. And then during the 1990s, HTML 3.5 was introduced with formatting tags, which made it more complex for developers to create websites, resulting in the creation of cascading style sheets. What I mean by this statement is, you might have seen the center tag in HTML. Center tag is something that centers elements, and the way this worked was, in 1990, during HTML 3.5, a lot of tags, HTML tags, were introduced, and the purpose of HTML was mainly about structuring the content. It was your skeleton of the website. It was never meant to style your content, or bring some difference in how you present the content. It was always about what the content is and how you structure it from a basic level, right? That was the idea of HTML. But when actually in 1990s HTML 3.5 was released, we had HTML tags like the italic tag, the strong tag. Then we had things like um, the center tag, which were more of alignment and how you show kind of tags, not really on how you structure your content. So it was going, it was very hard for developers to learn HTML back then, because some tags were this way, some tags were that way, some tags were used for storing content, some tags were used for alignment. You might have seen the Marquee Tag. This is one of the HTML tags that came up in the 1990s. And you've got a lot of things like this, which made HTML confusing, um, and just hard to use, right? So here is a sample snippet of CSS that you have, and we'll probably come back to this after a while. So moving forward, we have the emergence of so let's actually go back and let me finish up what I just started here. So then, after slowly, as the web evolved, we have had CSS, which is cascading style sheets. That's the full form of CSS, and the purpose of CSS is to style your content. So think of it this way: HTML is the skeleton, CSS is the clothes that you wear, right? That's the clothing, that's the thing that makes you beautiful, right? So that basically tells how you present the content. HTML is what is the content, what's the structure of the content. CSS is how you present the content, and JavaScript is basically an advanced thing which would dynamically change both of them, basically how you present it and what the content is, right? To bring more dynamic elements into your web page. So as CSS emerged, you can see we have a bit of CSS code here. CSS used to look like this. It in fact looks like this even today, where you have dot btn. Dot basically represents a class, and btn is the name of the class, where I'm saying color should be red. That is, the text color should be red. Alignment should be center. Remember, I said we used to have a center tag for this. We no longer have that now because CSS started handling things like that. CSS was born in the late 1990s, and then websites started to look much better than how they were before the CSS came. But there is only one problem with pure CSS. Imagine there's a button and the button looks certain way in Google Chrome. Without CSS, if you take the same button and open that same website with a bare bones button without any CSS, on your phone it would look different, on your computer it would look different, on a Mac it would look different, on a Windows PC it would look different, and on Linux machines again it would look completely different. It would depend on what browser you are using. Like for example, on Chrome and all the WebKit based browsers, it would look like a certain way. The button, it would have like a gray background, it would have a solid black border and things like that. On Firefox, the button would look completely different. So this was a big problem which was solved by CSS, where you can style your button to exactly suit the brand, suit the way that you want to show people, right? But the issue was, let's say I'm a web developer and I am doing web development back in the late 1990s or early 2000s. What I had to do was write the same button code every single time I had to develop a website. I had to start from scratch, fix alignment issues, then write the button, how the button should look like, do whole kinds of things to get to the website. So it's kind of like there was no templating system. Everything was from scratch. You had to do everything from the beginning. And so CSS frameworks came into the scene when came into the scene to solve this exact same problem, and that is every time you're having to recreate the button from scratch, because by default buttons look completely different in different platforms, right? So to prevent reinventing of HTML elements or writing the same styles again and again and again, CSS frameworks were projects that were started by open source developers. Mainly one popular CSS framework that I can name was Bootstrap, right? I'm sure all of you who are watching this session right now are aware of Bootstrap, and you have done at least something in Bootstrap. A fun fact is that Bootstrap was actually started by Twitter, the social media giant, which wanted to standardize how things would look. But then Bootstrap evolved and became so popular that it had its own maintaining team, and at the end of the day, it was completely separate, right? So the full name of Bootstrap was actually Twitter Bootstrap, because it was basically created by Twitter. Now, a lot of frameworks came out after Bootstrap, which basically solved the same problem. And that is, they made the button, like, for example, you have a few examples of how a Bootstrap button would look. They solved the problem of, they basically solved two problems. Number one, the buttons in all different browsers were looking completely different before a CSS framework came. When a CSS framework came, they standardized how a button should look. Like, for example, if you take a Bootstrap button, it will look that way, right? It will have that blue color, it will have that font, when you hover, it will have that border effect and that kind of thing, right? And then when the standardization came, we also no longer needed to start everything from scratch. It all looked the same in all browsers because Bootstrap handled the differences. And then it was when you had a Bootstrap website. Today, I am at a situation where if you can show me a website, I can tell you if that's made out of Bootstrap or not just by looking at the elements, because we've used Bootstrap so much that Bootstrap has the signature look to it, where anyone can very easily predict what's exactly going on with Bootstrap and how it's all happening, right? So this is the problem with all CSS frameworks right now. If I would like to name some of them, you can see Milligram CSS, you can see Bulma, then you have a lot of CSS frameworks that basically define how a button should look. And oftentimes you end up writing a lot of code to overwrite the styles that were set by Bootstrap or whatever framework you are using, right? So that takes us to the next slide, which is about which is an introduction about Tailwind CSS, which is a revolutionary CSS framework. Because if I show you the two code snippets that you are seeing on your monitor, the first one is a Bootstrap button where you have a BTN and BTN dash primary, right? So if I basically explain you, a BTN signifies or tells Bootstrap that, hey, style this like a button. This should be a button. Technically, you can apply the class to anything, but it just says style this as a button, right? BTN primary basically lets you choose between a lot of variants, like you have secondary, success, danger, warning, and a lot of them, right? So that's the thing. And when I say BTN primary, you know that the button is going to look exactly like this. It's a blue background button, it has this particular font, it's of this size and proportions, right? And as I said, oftentimes developers in this new era of web development, where every website has its own personality, it wants to look different, it wants to create that impression on the user. Web developers started to write additional CSS to override certain styles that were set by Bootstrap. So essentially, if you look at it from the core perspective, we had Bootstrap that set, for example, the font. We would basically write one more font CSS that would say, hey, don't use this font, use my font, right? So it's kind of like doing everything twice. Bootstrap would do it once, and then you would get it once more, you would override it once more. This is exactly the problem that Tailwind CSS tries to solve, and that is why it's a revolutionary framework. So if I compare the classes between both of them, you have BTN, which already has all the classes that are defined, and then you have the Tailwind button at the bottom, where you see it says BG Blue 500. That gives it a blue background. BG stands for background, blue is the color, and 500 is the shade at which the color should be applied at. Text white is basically saying that the button's text content should be in white color. Font bold is basically saying, hey, font weight use 600, which is the bold value. Px is padding in x-axis. So you might have drawn a lot of graphs and stuff in your maths in your math subject when you were in college or school. X-axis is basically the horizontal axis, and y-axis is what we have as a vertical axis. So px is basically padding horizontal, and py is basically padding vertical, if I'm not wrong. Yes, that's the thing. So that's how you make a button. And basically rounded is make the corners a little bit rounded. So as you might have got an idea about Tailwind, instead of defining exactly on how the button should look, Tailwind CSS gives you these utility classes. So these classes are actually called utility classes, where, for example, font bold is a class in CSS that does not have a lot of styles. It just only has one CSS rule, and that is font weight 600. That's it, right? And you can use this one single class n number of times anywhere in your HTML as long as you're happy with it, right? So because Tailwind CSS gives you this kind of approach, there's no one particular button, default look and feel that you get when you use Tailwind. So you no longer have to, it's still a CSS framework, but it's kind of like it's in between Bootstrap, where you get everything already designed for you, and pure CSS, where you will have to do it everything from scratch. So this is not, this is neither completely scratch nor nor everything predetermined like Bootstrap. So you can exactly design stuff, and you can exactly design web pages as you want with Tailwind CSS. And that's the reason why it's revolutionary. So let's move forward. And let's say, for example, you might ask me a few more examples. You might ask me, you might want to know more about a few more things about why Tailwind CSS is so good, right? Number one, it produces smaller bundles, in the sense that, let's say you have Bootstrap. First, you have all the code that Bootstrap needs, and then you have your own custom code which overrides the classes that of Bootstrap that you've just defined at the top of the document from Bootstrap. Tailwind does not do that because of its utility class architecture, where there is no one button. There is, for example, let's say if I go to the previous slide, you will see, let's say if I have font bold, there is only one font bold class, and font weight 600 is never repeated in the Tailwind CSS class. Hence you end up with a relatively small CSS bundle when you compare it with Bootstrap or any other framework. Sometimes even when you compare it with pure CSS as well, but not always, right? And then one more advantage that you have with Tailwind is faster designing. And the way that happens is, traditionally when you are developing websites, you would have the HTML file and the CSS file both as two different files. Now I'm sure all of you who have worked on a production grade application which is just using CSS or maybe Sass, you will find there are tons and tons of CSS files and tons of be it HTML or React or any other, or Solid.js or Svelte or any framework, right? So essentially what happens is the developer hops between HTML, the markup, and the styles, the CSS. The developer has to keep switching between, to change how a particular element on the production website looks like. And trust me, after some point this becomes quite complicated, and you need sophisticated editors like Visual Studio Code, Atom. We have the new JetBrains fleet. You need editors like these which are very intelligent and which can figure out which classes are actually being referenced from your HTML, and take you right there in super quick ways, right? So that's why, because with Tailwind that all does not happen. You have all the classes, everything, all the CSS rules, basically most of them. If I go back to the previous slide just once, you will see most of the rules that you want, CSS rules that you want, are now CSS classes on themselves, which we call them as utility classes. So now that something like that has happened, you do not need to switch between a CSS file and your HTML file. All you have to do is just focus on your HTML and look at the design and how the design is basically appearing, right? You don't need to do this switching between your CSS file and your HTML file, because of course everything is in one place. So that basically results in faster designing and faster prototyping and faster development, because you're not roaming here and there. And then Visual Studio Code as amazing support with Tailwind. You can have dynamic CSS classes generate, and you can press control space on your VS Code and it'll just autocomplete, right? And then one more important thing, one more point to use Tailwind CSS is its easy installation. In the latest version of Tailwind CSS, all you have to do is just click on, all you have to do is just copy the script tag, put it in your HTML, and you're done. That's it. It's as simple as that. You don't have to have any JavaScript bundler. You don't have to have anything. All you have to do is just put one simple script tag, and you're good to go. right? So that's why Tailwind CSS is super easy to install, right? And then, Tailwind CSS has superb documentation. As someone who has used in Tailwind CSS in a lot of production projects, I can say I've never had any problem with Tailwind CSS documentation. Everything is just so clear and concise, and everything is where you expect to be found, right? So they have like a superb documentation, right? And then the final point that I'd like to speak up today is Tailwind CSS basically works with all the existing tools. Let's say, you have a website, you have a React.js website, right? React is a framework that's quite popular. And let's say you have a React.js website. Tailwind CSS can work with first class support with React.js basically. Tailwind CSS can also work with a whole bunch of other frameworks like Stencil.js, Svelte, you have Vue, you have Angular, whole bunch of other frameworks will work out of the box. Not necessarily out of the box, you need to have basic configuration set up, but it's pretty easy to set up the configuration, and you will have pre-made templates available on GitHub for almost all of the popular front-end frameworks, right? So these were the main reasons on why you should be using Tailwind CSS in your front-end projects. So let's just slow down a bit and see what are the downsides of using Tailwind CSS, because not everything is good with Tailwind. It also has its own dark spots, right? So the first and foremost problem that you'll see right off the bat is your HTML starts to look like this. And by like this, I mean it's too verbose. You have your CSS, that is your styles, and your skeleton, the markup, in one single place, which is oftentimes a lot more confusing than just having your pure HTML and CSS in two separate files. Yes, I said it improves your development speed, but you also need to get habituated to reading both a lot of CSS classes, both your styles and the actual content on the same place. So it'll take some, getting habituated to. But, one of the downsides is to a developer who is not so familiar with Tailwind, it'll look like complete chaos, right? There are too many CSS classes, too much stuff going on, right? Then when I see HTML like this, sorry.
Sneha, can you mute your mic?
Perfect. Don't worry, everyone. I'll be taking feedback from you in just a few minutes. Once this presentation is over, you can ask me doubts, you can ask everything. But for now, just hold on, just for a few minutes, so that we can finish up, we can get to a point, right? So that's the thing. There is a downside with Tailwind CSS, and that is your HTML is too verbose. And when I see HTML like this, that's my expression basically. The bunny is completely 100% accurate, because sometimes it gets hard to understand what exactly is going on and modify something that you have coded like 6 months ago, right? Now, let's talk about what we will be doing in tomorrow's session, where we will be doing a simple blog layout. We will be coding a simple blog layout tomorrow using Tailwind CSS, because we've covered up all the theory today, and that's pretty much it. So I'd like to thank Aditya Sahu and Dhruv Solanki and Ria Sahu for giving me this opportunity to speak here on behalf of Learn With community, and a shameless plug here. Do follow me on Twitter, because I put content like this. Like, for example, I have a thread on 8 resources for Tailwind CSS, where I've shown a website where you can grab pre-made components like Bootstrap. For Tailwind, I have shown a Tailwind CSS converter that can take your existing CSS and change it to Tailwind classes. We have Tailwind grids. We have a whole bunch of other things that you can explore, you can learn more about. So do follow me. I make threads like this, informative threads like this, both about web development, Tailwind, and a lot of other things. So this is my Twitter account. And now getting back to the presentation, um, So let's take up any Q&As that you all have. I'm officially done with the presentation. So